93 years, 2 months, and 25 days ago from the recording of this video, New York City started planning a subway line. A line that would run the entire length of Manhattan on 2nd Avenue. 6 years, 2 months, and 27 days ago, Phase 1 was complete. So the time it took between conceiving the idea of the subway line to the finishing of its Phase 1 out of 4 phases was 87 years, 11 months, and 358 days. You know this is bad when it exceeds the average human lifespan. So if you were born right around the time they started attempting the 2nd Avenue line, statistically speaking, you wouldn't have even lived long enough to see Phase 1. And mind you, we have 3 more phases to go before realizing a complete 2nd Avenue subway line. So how did we get here, and where do we go from here? Welcome to Urban Caffeine. My name is Thea, and you're watching a channel that overthinks public transit. If you think about public transit as much as I do, let the internet know by hitting that like button. Let's start from the beginning. There was already an existing line on 2nd Avenue. It was an elevated above-ground line called the 2nd Avenue L. And there were other elevated lines all over New York City. If you're familiar with the High Line, that was a former elevated line. But there were several problems with elevated lines. One, they were noisy and they produced smoke and soot. Nobody wants to live near smoke and soot. It's just bad for your health and just plain dirty. Secondly, elevated lines have lower capacity compared to the underground subway. And New York's population was growing. In 1920, New York City was the most populated city in the United States. And out of that 5.6 million, Manhattan alone had 2.2 million souls living on the island. So yeah, there was a need for better mass public transit. And lastly, it's more for aesthetics. Elevated lines darkened the city and obstructed views, resulting to lower property value. So the idea was to dig a tunnel so that we could have an underground subway to replace the 2nd Avenue L. By 1929, we were off to work. The original plan was to create a line that would run along 2nd Avenue from Houston Street all the way to 125th Street in Harlem. With as much planning as they did, no construction progress was made because the market crashed that same year, which triggered the Great Depression. And as a double whammy, World War II also broke out. The whole country was deeply affected by this. By the way, this picture right here is a free soup kitchen run by public enemy number 1, Al Capone. It fed thousands of Chicagoans during the Great Depression. They didn't ask for proof of unemployment, and you could even get second servings, no question asked. Although Al Capone's wealth was questionable, this video is not gonna go there. Back in New York, there were also bread lines. Times were tough. So clearly there were other things to worry about, so the government had to scale back spending and reprioritize its budget. In the transit sector, this meant discontinuing the 2nd Avenue subway line. In the 1940s, the elevated train is fully dismantled. Leading up to the 50s, a new plan was made for the subway that would replace it. By the 50s, they came up with a budget of $500 million for the subway using bonds. But eventually, that money went to improving other parts of the existing system. But here comes the 60s and 70s. The population of New York is now 7.78 million. That's a 38% increase from the 20s, a little over a third. Again, because of population increase, demand for better public transit was rising up in conversation. Specifically in the Upper East Side, where there was only one existing line left, which today we call the 456. While in contrast, in the Upper West, across the park, there were 2 lines which today we call the ACE and 123. With a growing population in the Upper East Side, this single line needed some support. In 1964, Congress passed the Urban Mass Transportation Act to fund mass transit. Because of this act, the 2nd Avenue project got some federal funding. Along with help from the state and the city, there was finally a budget for 2nd Avenue. So construction began. This time, they were able to dig out 3 pieces of the tunnel. One tunnel from 99th Street to 105th Street, another from 110th to 120th, and near Canal Street. But that's it, because in the 1970s, there was another market crash. As you can see, there's a pattern going on here. The city had a large deficit, and again, funds needed to be reevaluated. Also, there were other projects that were being prioritized. Among them was this project called Westway Highway, which was somewhat controversial. At the time, during the 70s, this was the largest public works debate in New York City's history. To give you an idea, the most expensive public works project was the World Trade Center with the Twin Towers. And this version of the World Trade Center cost $1 billion. The Westway Highway was estimated to be at $2.1 billion, which is more than double. Because of this man, Robert Moses, the well-known antagonist of public transportation. You see, Robert Moses was fascinated by highways and automobiles. He loved cars and roads. In fact, he's a major influence on how highways and city planning is done today, which we are trying to reverse. He lobbied very hard to make this Westway Highway a reality. And you're probably wondering, what the heck is the Westway Highway? That's because it never happened. The Westway Highway was supposed to be this underground 6-lane highway covered by green space running 4 miles from the Battery all the way to 42nd Street along the Hudson River. The controversies around this were both environmental and social. Environmental because the construction would have needed new landfill that would have disrupted the natural habitat of the Hudson River. And the construction would have created a lot of pollution that would have been no bueno for people living nearby. And speaking of people living nearby, the social issue around this project was that it would have displaced hundreds of businesses and residences along this path. Activists and communities rallied hard against this, saying that money should be funneled towards public transit instead. Robert Moses tried to throw his influence into the ring, but in the 1970s, that happened to be the decade that his influence was in decline. And thank goodness for that, because by the 80s, the Westway Highway was officially canceled. As a side note, he died in 1981. But the cancellation of the Westway Highway did not mean that there was money for the 2nd Avenue project. There were other transportation projects that were prioritized, like the expansion of the Long Island Railroad, which included electrifying a couple of its lines, adding a 3rd track to the main line, and improving Jamaica Station. Plus, the 2nd Avenue project this time had some technical difficulties. The project would have needed to relocate utilities and buildings along its path. After all, New York in the 70s is different from New York in the 1920s. This was just too complicated and money was tough, so ultimately this project once again was discontinued. So we're finally getting close to current time. By the 2000s, population has now surpassed 8 million. Not too off from the 70s, but still growing. Not only was population growing, but traffic congestion was really bad, and along with traffic congestion was air pollution and higher carbon emission. So again, demand for better public transportation was there. New York State approved the Transportation Bond Act. Through this act, New York City received funding for public transportation to include the 2nd Avenue project. On top of that, it also received federal funding through the New Starts program. The New Starts program comes from the 90s and it provides funding to public transportation projects that meet certain criteria. So we have federal funding, state funding, and the city and MTA are pitching in as well. So we once again have budget for the 2nd Avenue project. Now it's off to construction. And you might be thinking, oh no, what about the 2008 financial crisis? Yes, the 2008 market crash did affect the construction industry. And with the 2nd Avenue subway project, it faced things like labor shortages and supply chain issues. This slowed down construction and raised the costs. But the project did not get canceled, and we know this for a fact because after 87 years, 11 months, and 358 days, Phase 1 of the 2nd Avenue line was complete and fully functional. Phase 1 included the completion of 3 subway stations. Right now, these 3 stations are serviced by the Q train. Having the Q run along the Upper East Side helps alleviate some of the load on the 4, 5, 6 trains that run parallel to it. So what now? We have 3 more phases to go with the 2nd Avenue line. Phase 2 will add 3 more stations to the north where it can connect to the 4, 5, and 6. So it's an easier transfer to and from the Bronx. Phase 2 is under construction as we speak and is estimated to be done before the end of this decade. Fingers crossed. Phase 3 involves extending the line to Houston Street. This is still in the planning stage and no dates are set for construction. And phase 4 involves extending the line from Houston to Hanover Square. As with phase 3, this is still in planning with no dates for construction. So there you have it. You are filled in on the 2nd Avenue saga. I'm sure there are details that I've left out, information that I've glossed over. Feel free to comment down below. I truly believe that every tunnel, alleyway, building, brick, and even graffiti in New York City has a story. So next time you're riding the Q on the Upper East, know that that line was a century in the making, and hope that it's not 2 centuries before we get to phase 3. If you enjoyed this video and want to support this channel, consider a Patreon membership. For the price of about 1 subway swipe, you can ensure that the next video is going to get published. I don't really have a team that helps me out. I do all the writing, the graphics, the filming, and the editing. So it does take a lot to make these videos, and I will try very hard to keep this channel going. And if you cannot support through Patreon, don't sweat it. One of the best ways to support this channel is by sharing it with someone you know who you think will like these videos, because growing this channel's community also ensures its longevity. With that said, thank you all so much for watching, and until the next video, have a great week ahead and happy New Yorking.